So there's a delay usually. So I'm not yet.
There is a delay, but you should be.
Thanks for the gift.
Yeah. Thank you so much for getting us started in the right direction. Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. So, hopefully, I wonder how many people here made it to my special guest that I had on, Cynthia Thorton. From we were talking about the Luigi Mangione case. I had an attorney from New York on with me, and that was a great special event. Unfortunately, like I said, she got heckled a little bit at the end, so I feel bad for her, and we took care of that. But because of that, I've got my wife new administrator privileges. So if my wife shuts you down and spanks you, that's something we'll have to talk about later. I'm pretty sure she will do a really good job, and if not, I'll talk to her and be like, yeah, maybe you shouldn't have banned that person or whatever. As an aside, Rhonda, the first choice is always to just mute them for this live only, because kicking them out entirely or blocking them entirely is like a last resort thing. So there.
Chicken Nugget wants to know if we posted that live on YouTube.
We did post that live on YouTube. Above my head in TikTok, if you're looking, Devil's Advocates 2024 is my account on TikTok. You could go to you can click on my videos and lives, and there's a recorded live of the live with Cynthia.
By the way, I don't see you live over here on YouTube yet.
You don't see me live on YouTube? It says I'm broadcasting.
Okay, maybe I did something wrong.
Hit refresh or something.
Oh, I gotta hit the live button.
Yeah. All right.
All right. I got it.
So what was I going to say about that? Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't have the sound. I screwed up. I've never done the mirroring of my phone and broadcasting simultaneously to TikTok or to YouTube. And her volume was low. So I was too hot and she was too quiet. So the sound is not as good as it could be. And unfortunately, because I talk a lot, I did most of the talking anyway, so it's okay in that regard. But as one person pointed out, it would have been a lot better if especially for your guest, if you had reversed those things and she was louder than you. And I agree. Like when I have a special guest on, they should be the prominent feature. Although Cynthia and I did talk ahead of time, and she was perfectly fine with me doing most of the talking. So just in case you were wondering if I just totally talked over my guest, that was something we agreed or she felt comfortable with from the very beginning. So just to let you know, we did talk all that out before she got on the live. It is now 6 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get into my formal thing. If I can click on stuff without showing the wrong stuff and having some kind of horrendous mistake of some kind, that would be bad for all of us. All right, so as I said, tonight's going to be all about Bryan Kohberger. I do have a pretty lengthy monologue that I want to do, and by monologue I mean it's more like I want to ramble about our judicial system, and I want to use the Kohberger situation and Luigi by extension, and how the prosecution and the federal government are failing in our American justice system in some of the principles that we uphold supposedly in this country. Both of these cases, the Idaho 4 murders, Bryan Kohberger and Luigi Mangione, are high-profile national interest stories. And in both cases, the prosecution and law enforcement are acting in what I would call bad faith. They are doing things that the system was not designed for them to do, and I want to highlight that, because again, one of the things that we're going to hit tonight is the big document dump that happened on Luigi Mangione. And if you're looking at my website right now on YouTube, I'm going to just show that site here, the coi.isc.idaho.gov, cases of interest. So there's a place there on the Idaho page where you can click on cases of interest. There's 3 links. One of them is Bryan Kohberger. If you click on that, you'll see that they are constantly updating the timeline. I'm showing that now on the YouTube channel. Constantly updating the website with new information. What has happened, of course, if you have been following the Bryan Kohberger situation, is you know that there's been an unprecedented gag order in this case for 2 years. The murders happened November 13th, 2022, and the first judge in the case that kind of came along put a massive gag order on everything. That should tell you something right off the bat, and it's going to be part of my bitch tonight, as about how when the government decides to put a gag order, or the court system decides to put a gag order on stuff, it leaves the public of having to speculate about what's going on. There's no transparency in our legal system. They can do all kinds of shady and frankly illegal things, and you don't get to know what's going on or understand, because they're covering, or they're protecting what they're doing behind closed doors with these gag orders. And so if we want to have a better legal system, we got to move away from these continued no cameras in the courtroom, gag orders that don't allow anybody to talk. It is clear in the case of the Idaho 4 that victims' families were contacted by law enforcement and asked not to talk about what they saw. Family members were, for example, were able to see autopsy reports and know exactly what happened to their child in the murder, and yet told not to tell people about it and not to talk about it. And as Steve Gonzalez said, it's not fair. He paid for the right to talk about these things. He that's his daughter. He should be able to say something, and yet he's imploring the media to if they're not going to let him talk, to tell the people what really happened. So this gag order doesn't just affect you and me and our ability to talk about it. It affects the victims as well, and the families of the victims who aren't allowed to talk about certain things, or at least they're heavily persuaded. And keep in mind that nobody can necessarily force somebody not to speak. Well, I mean, you do have the ability to hit some people with contempt of court and those kind of things. So there are some punitive measures. But for the most part, a lot of people just do what they're told, especially by law enforcement, because in this country, a lot of us have this mentality. Boy, do I look super washed out with the lighting. I'm trying to fix the lighting, but I feel like I look like a pasty ghost right now. Anyways, in our system, if law enforcement asks you not to say something, a lot of people just play ball with law enforcement. They think that it's the right thing to do, even if they don't think they have to. They just do. And so this unprecedented gag order has allowed the law enforcement to keep people silent about what's really happening. Let me remind you that the devil's advocate believes in the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. And while it may be possible that Bryan Kohberger indeed is guilty of what they say that he's done, we need to wait until we have the day in court. And that fight in court needs to be a fair fight. And what I'm going to ramble a little bit about tonight is that it's not a fair fight. And I'm going to show you it's not a fair fight based on the new documents that have been released. But I'm going to kind of go into a little bit of my monologue. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to cover my overview of the legal system, how it's supposed to work, and how our system's failing us. And then I'm going to use very specific examples for the last part of the night, using the documents, the most recent released documents from Bryan Kohberger's case, to show you how our legal system is failing us and how it's not a fair fight. Okay, so let's get into that. Now, first of all, I had this image that I wanted to show, and again, let's make sure I show the right one. So I got this Lady Justice on my site on YouTube. Lady Justice, the traditional, it's a Roman figure from a Roman goddess, Justisa, or Lustisa and Justisa. It's the traditional scale holding woman of justice with the blindfold. The blindfold actually wasn't added until about the 16th century. And originally it actually had the opposite meaning that it has today. Today what we believe when we say justice is blind is that justice is supposed to not hold any person in higher regard than another. This is important, especially in these cases where a court system, a judge, is not to perceive the federal government and law enforcement as having more value than the defendant. That court system, we believe, should be blind to who's bringing forth the charges. It can't be the big guy fighting the little guy, and therefore the big guy is the one who's presumed to be telling the truth, right? So we're going to talk about that whole system about justice is blind. Now, originally it actually had the opposite meaning. It talked about how we're kind of blind to being fair. Now it's meant to mean you are to be blind to giving one side or the other credence. A judge has a job, or a jury, by the way. And part of this show is to educate people on the legal system. So keep in mind that in our legal system in America, you have the right to a jury trial, but you can also waive your right to a jury trial and have a judge oversee and make a decision on their own. So sometimes people would prefer that a judge make the decision and not a jury of your peers. But in our country, you have the right to a jury by your peers. And so you could have a judge or you could have a jury. In either case, the judge's job in that whole thing is to listen impartially and let both sides present their case. Now, as I've mentioned many, many times, what in reality happens is it's gotten to the point where instead of what it should be, which is a judicial system in which the prosecution says, hey, I think you did this murder or whatever, and here's why I think you did it. And it should be without emotion. It shouldn't be without anger and prejudice. It should just be like, hey, I kind of think you did it because we got you on camera doing it, or we got you on camera going to the murder scene and leaving the murder scene. So therefore, logic would tell you that you're the one who did it because you're the only one who had the opportunity and the motive and the time, right? And it's supposed to be done impartially and without anger, without prejudice. Likewise, the defense in a perfect system would be like, okay, we think our guy is innocent, and here's why we think he's innocent, because of this, this, and this. And it shouldn't be a nasty situation. Instead, what's happened in our court system in America is we've gotten to the point where the job of the prosecution is to convict and do everything they can to get that conviction, regardless of whether or not they're trying to hide information that would let the jury know that that person wasn't guilty. That's all considered fair game nowadays. Our legal system has changed in America where it's basically, I'm going to do my best case to tell you why this guy's guilty, and you're going to do the best case to say why the guy's innocent. Both of us could be misleading the jury about the real facts in the matter. That's for the jury to figure out. And so that's the system that we've started to develop. It's not the way it's supposed to be. There should be no emotions in this thing. It should be just facts, presentation of facts. And a judge can oversee the decision of what is facts and what's not. By the way, to give you further education into our system, all these motions in limine that you're seeing, so there's a lot of there's motions in limine. In Kohberger's case, what this basically means is at this point in time, we are set for a trial of Bryan Kohberger. They're getting ready to go into the courtroom. Motions in limine is a process in which both sides say, let's fight out amongst each other about what we're allowed to say in the courtroom and show a jury and what we're not. And that way we don't waste the jury's time fighting about something that could have been resolved behind closed doors. Perfect example what we're going to see tonight is that the prosecution wants to play dirty pool in the courtroom with the jury. And so the motions in limine is the process for the defense to say, look, if you do what you're planning on doing in front of a jury, I'm going to have to spend a crap ton of time explaining to the jury what shit you just did so that they can understand that was bullshit. And it's going to be a waste of the jury's time for me to have to explain to them that what you just did was bullshit. On top of that, you're just tainted the jury because they might not be able to follow that super long fight. And so what we have is a legal process where these motions in limine allow both sides to fight this out ahead of time. And the judge says, okay, look, prosecution, you can't bring up this because it's just going to lead to a huge fight in the courtroom in front of the jury, and they don't have time nor the need to see all that. So we're going to agree. I'm going to make a ruling ahead of time. You are allowed to say this. You're not allowed to say that. That's why if you've watched a lot of court cases, you see situations where it seems like, somebody will say objection and they'll say some kind of objection and you have no idea where that came from. It came from these motions in limine, things that were agreed upon before the trial even began. And so they might be saying, hey, objection, we talked about this. They weren't allowed to mention the word bushy eyebrows. That's going to be one of the things in Bryan Kohberger's thing. We've discussed the whole term bushy eyebrows. So right now there's a motion in limine where the two sides are fighting over the description by Dylan of the person in the house having bushy eyebrows. So there's a fight going on. Like, he's like, look, if you refer to our client, the defense is saying this, if you refer to our client in the courtroom, the killer had bushy eyebrows, and my client's sitting there with what could be perceived as bushy eyebrows, people are automatically it's gonna be taken as if they directly are looking at that killer and that's the guy who did it. He's the one with the bushy eyebrows sitting right there in the courtroom. This is prejudicial. And so what the defense and the prosecution are arguing about right now is whether or not they can use the term bushy eyebrows in the courtroom to describe the situation. We're going to get into a little bit of that legal document at the end so you can see exactly the wording and how these fights happen in a court of law and what the judge is going to have to decide on, what they're weighing when they get the argument from the yes, we can do that, or no, you can't do that, and what the judge the argument is about why they should use certain wordings or other wordings. Keep in mind, our right to impartial trial in this country is based on the 14th Amendment, the 5th and 6th Amendments due to your due process, fair trial, all these things. Judges take a federal oath that says they will administer justice without respect to persons, with due equal right to the poor and the rich. Again, it can't be that because you're the federal government and you have the perception of being the good guys, or because you're the cops and you have the perception of being the good guys, the judges to throw all that away and be like, it's just, you're Joe Blow against Joe Blow, and your status, your stature means nothing in a court of law. You need to just present your best case period. And I'm not going to be prejudiced by your position and your status and the fact that I get federal dollars in my court system from the federal government, and therefore maybe having a desire to win cases for the federal government. All that shit is supposed to be out the window. Also, same with lawyers. Lawyers are supposed to ethically be bound to uphold justice, not just find out who wins. Unfortunately, like I said in my huge long monologue, because this is what I do, I ramble at the mouth like a foaming little freaking 5-year-old, is that we've gotten to the system where I'm going to do everything I can to show you only what will get a conviction. The other person is going to show you only what you can to get the guy off, and the jury has to decide who's telling the truth and who's lying to you. Neither one should be lying. Neither one of them should be hiding anything from you. And we should have an open and transparent legal system in which there are cameras in the courtroom. That's probably not going to happen with the Bryan Kohberger situation. It's not going to happen with the Luigi Mangione situation, which only leads to what I have to deal with, is that as a true crime investigator / reporter, as I'm covering these stories, I get to have the federal government and media shame me for talking about things that you should just shut your mouth. You don't know what's going on in this case. And you're right. If you gag order it and you don't allow cameras in the thing, then I have no choice but to do my best, try to read between the lines and read the documents for myself and expose the bullshit that you're doing. So that's what my show does, is like, you're right. Just have an open court system. Let us see everything ourselves, and you won't have a bunch of true crime people spreading vicious rumors because you won't tell them what's really going on. So in a way, they've created this monster themselves. And also because our system isn't working is exactly why we have appeals courts. Because it's so bad in America that when somebody does get convicted, you have the right to appeal if you objected something and they just moved on because they've got a desire to convict. And they're like, yep, whatever. I hear your objection, but I don't care. Keep going. If you have objected to something, even if the judge overrules you, anything that has been objected to in the court can be the grounds of an appeal. And so we have an appeals process in case you just get a bad judge who just has the desire to make sure that the federal government or the state wins their cases every time they come into their courtroom. So let's talk a little bit now with the remaining time that we have about is there anything I should be slowing down for, Rhonda? You always say that I talk too much and too fast.
No, we're okay.
No, we're okay. All right. So I'm going to outline a few things for you about why I think the prosecution wants to prejudice the jury. And again, this is the system that we're getting in America, where the prosecution will purposely do everything they can to make a guy look guilty and will keep things out of exculpatory information that might make the person look innocent. They do everything they can to keep that information to be seen by the public or by a jury. So they actually will make concerted efforts to keep information that might be true out of the eyes of someone that might shed doubt into the person's guilt that they're trying to convict. That's not really how it's supposed to work. So I'm going to show you a little bit of how the prosecution's using tricks in the wording to try and suggest that Kohberger can't be ruled out, for example. And one of the things that we'll look at is touch DNA, right? So as a preview a little bit, one of the arguments in the court case is going to be that they're trying to use the term touch DNA. They do that because they want the jury to believe that Bryan Kohberger literally touched the knife sheath. It's touch DNA, so that means he must have touched it. So there's a fight going on about the fact that touch DNA does not really mean touch DNA. It means that there is latent DNA. How it got onto the knife sheath, whether it was a finger that touched it or a piece of skin cell that fell off the face and landed on it, we don't know how the DNA got it, and neither does the expert know how the DNA got on that item. So to call it touch DNA prejudices the jury into saying Bryan Kohberger literally touched that knife sheath. We don't know that. And in fact, if you've been following this case, you already know that the defense is going to say that Bryan Kohberger did not touch the knife sheath, that knife sheath and his DNA were planted at the scene. And I know if you're a Bryan Kohberger guilter, if you will, as some people call it. I don't like that word, but if you believe that he's guilty hands down, then you already are like rolling your eyes like, oh, bullshit, he didn't touch it. They already told us his DNA's on it, he touched it. Well, again, the defense would say the fact that that's the only piece of DNA you have in the entire house on 4 different victims all over the house, his DNA should have been everywhere. There is something to the effect, by the way, if you don't know this, 30 to 40,000 skin cells are shed off of your body every single minute. every minute you're shedding 30 to 40,000 skin cells. So a fight that happens inside a house with 4 victims, of which at least 2 we know were fighting back and had defensive wounds, were awake and fighting back. There would have been, in my opinion, DNA all over those victims. There would have been DNA that had been sloughed off skin. There would be a struggle. There would be DNA everywhere. The fact that the only piece of DNA we have of Bryan Kohberger's is what we're fighting over, the term touch DNA or trace DNA or latent DNA, a speck the size of a grain of sand. That's what's in the house of Bryan Kohberger's. So again, the people who have already decided, because of the court of public opinion and the dirty pool that the prosecution is playing, have already decided Bryan Kohberger's guilty. All they keep repeating is, I don't understand how anybody can think he's not guilty. His DNA was literally found in the house. It's not paying attention to literally how much DNA wasn't in the house. There is no conceivable explanation, in my opinion, how someone can fight with 4 individuals and leave a speck of DNA behind. Now, one can argue, well, somehow it happened because that DNA is not there, which leads to maybe somebody's DNA is there, but maybe it wasn't Bryan Kohberger's. And I'm just playing devil's advocates because that's the name of my channel, Devil's Advocates. So, we're going to talk about other tricks that the prosecution and the media are playing. These tricks, did you have something, Rhonda?
No.
These tricks include things like shaming everyone for talking about the case by using the victims. Shame on you for talking about this. These victims were horrendously murdered and their families have to deal with everything. So you asking questions about Kohberger's innocence or guilt is shameful. Shame on you. That is, to me, disgusting in the sense that our country believes in the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. For you to say shame on anyone for presuming Bryan Kohberger is innocent is horrendous. But you trying to use the victims, and this happened horrendously in the Sandy Hook shooting. Remember the Sandy Hook shooting? How dare you question the children? Children died in that situation, and they would bring up children every single day to shame people into not talking about it because of the children. Now we've got the same thing. These are young individuals in their 20s, college students, children of parents, and they're using the same kind of argument. This is disgusting for the children. Quit talking about it for the children. Somebody's child died. 100% true. It is a tragedy. 100%. Those kids did not deserve what happened to them whatsoever. But to shame people for talking about it is to say that you already know who did it. He's guilty, and therefore to say anything other than he's guilty is shameful. And so I rail against this in my channel. Again, I don't have a problem if Bryan Kohberger is guilty. If it turns out if Bryan Kohberger is guilty, then so be it. But what I want is a fair and open and transparent court system and trial, which we're not going to have. So I'm going to do my best to bring up the shit that they're not telling you. And again, at the end of the day, if it turns out that he's guilty, then so be it. But I want to be upfront with you of what underhanded tricks that they're doing to try to make this guilty person guilty in their mind, whether or not he did it or not. And by the way, I had some behind the scenes discussions with some people, and they know law enforcement, and they have friends and family in law enforcement. I've had multiple people who have friends in law enforcement who say that their law enforcement family member has admitted that police sometimes plant evidence because we have to get the bad guy. They know the person did it, and they sometimes will plant evidence. I've had multiple people who know police officers who admit that, it's not even considered a bad thing. We know the guy did it, so if we have to plant something to make sure he goes down for it, then so be it. Because our system is too weighted to the presumption of innocence, and too many criminals walk. And so you can almost justify the actions of law enforcement sometimes because they're trying to do the right thing. But again, in an open and transparent system, it is not acceptable for law enforcement to plant evidence at a scene. So again, this is one of those difficult things as I go through my huge monologue, which is that how will you feel if Bryan Kohberger is guilty of it, but that law enforcement had to plant evidence on the scene to make him guilty of it because he would have gotten away with it? Are you okay with the planting of evidence? Are you okay with illegal things being done to convict somebody who really is guilty because you don't want to see him walk? Or do you believe in the due process and that law should be upheld just as much to all the standards, and they can't do illegal things? Because again, the counter to this is that innocent people go to jail all the time because they're convinced you're guilty, and they will just plant something if they need to. Now, I'm not saying law enforcement did plant the knife, and I'm not saying those things. I'm saying that's the allegation And actually, the defense hasn't specifically stated whether it was law enforcement that planted it. But again, one of the documents I'm going to show you is they keep bringing up a specific FBI person's name over and over again. It's as if the defense is trying to prime us a little bit that there is somebody in law enforcement or somebodies in law enforcement who have a real, I got to make sure I don't keep saying the word I want to say, a real desire to make sure that Bryan Kohberger goes down, to the point that they might be willing to do sketchy and illegal things in order to make it stick. Let's talk about one other shady thing that they're doing before we get into the documents tonight. And I realize, wow, I got 30 minutes of rambling, and then we'll get into some documents. 68 terabytes, not gigabytes, 68 terabytes of information at least has been released. Has been released as discovery and dumped on the defense. That would literally take years to go through. Now let me explain to you what the defense, this is going to be one of the documents that we're going to review as well. What the defense is saying is, look, in the courtroom, you've given us 68 terabytes of information, which includes, for example, a couple of hours of video footage from Albertsons, of which Bryan Kohberger allegedly was in the store for like 5-10 minutes. Now, in reality, what's likely going to happen is they're only going to show the moments that Bryan Kohberger was in the Albertsons store. But what they turned over to the defense is 2 hours of the Albertsons footage, right? And so what the defense is saying is, look, you're not going to make the jury sit through 2 hours of the Albertsons video footage to say, hey, by the way, about 1 minute and 60 seconds of that is what was important. After you watch the 2 hours, let's now focus on the 1 minute that we wanted you to pay attention. They won't waste the jury's time with that. So if they're not going to waste the jury's time with that, why are they wasting the defense's time with it? So this is the logical argument. They're playing dirty pool. What they want to do is they want to dump a shit ton of information on the defense and say, you guys have all the information you need. Go find it. Meanwhile, they're planning on pulling out very specific 30 seconds here, 1 minute here to show the jury, because they're not going to show 16. They got 16 different CCTV footages that each run a couple of hours each, just so they can show allegedly the white Elantra. My sound keeps going in and out. That's horrible. Does anybody else hear that? Let me continue on with that thought, and then I'll see if other people are saying I've got sound issues. So they're gonna pull out just some very specific time stamps where Bryan Kohberger's car allegedly is coming and going from the scene. So the defense would say, again, just tell us the time markers that you're relying on, rather than say somewhere in this 2 hour footage 16 times from 60 different things, because you're not going to show the jury 16 different footages for 2 hours each to pull out 30 seconds. Now, you would argue, what does it matter? The defense has to know what they're going to be going for as well. Not necessarily, because the prosecution could have a sneaky one up their boots, whatever you want to call it, up their sleeves, where they're planning on showing something that happened in the first hour. But because they're not telling the defense, hey, by the way, you missed it, there was something that happened in the first hour, and they're not going to tell the defense that they're going to bring that up, they're playing dirty pool again. So one of the documents in here that we're going to look at a little bit is how the defense has successfully argued to have the prosecution literally point out the timestamps on some of the videos. So they've been able to pull that off. They've been able to say, hey, go in there and tell us, okay, we're going to use the time from 5:26 a.m. to 5:27 a.m. to show this. So some of that they've got, because originally the whole plan was dump 68 terabytes. I think they referred to it as like 16,000 copies of equivalent of 16,000 copies of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and then ask the defense to just figure out what our case is. Here's the dump. So we've covered all of that. So we're going to start kind of getting into a couple of other things that I want to hit before we look at the actual documents, and that is motivations for murder. So a lot of people believe that you need to have motive and opportunity. One of the things that's struggling with us right now is the motive for Bryan Kohberger. What is his motive? Some would say he's a sociopath, he's a psychopath. By the way, there are documents being fought right now, motions in limine, about whether or not they can use the phrase psychopath or sociopath in reference to Bryan Kohberger. This has already been ruled on by the judge. So the prosecution, so let me back this up. The defense said, we want to exclude the use of the word sociopath or psychopath to refer to our client. The prosecution responded, because they usually respond before the judge makes a rule on it, and said, we have no intention of calling Bryan Kohberger a sociopath or a psychopath on the stand or in the trial. So therefore, it's a moot point. So what happens, for those who want to understand our legal system better, the defense says, let's please make a decision. We will not refer to Bryan Kohberger as a psychopath or a sociopath. The prosecution says we have no intention of calling him a sociopath or a psychopath. So if when we're in the courtroom and someone says, the prosecution says, so what did you think when this psychopath, you'll hear objection. And the objection will be, we already fucking talked about this. You can't use the word psychopath in referring to Bryan Kohberger. And the judge will be like, sustained. We agreed to this ahead of time. Now in the courtroom, the jury's going to like, what the hell is that all about? Why can't we call him a psychopath? This because these things have been decided ahead of time. So I'm trying to educate people on how this system works. Then there's the system of, so there's this motivation problem, right? Which is that Bryan Kohberger has no known motivation for killing these individuals. There is some loose belief that Bryan Kohberger had an Instagram account and may have been liking, as in like thumbs up or hearting or whatever you want to call it, just having some kind of interaction with Madison Mogen's Instagram account, not Kaylee's. And Kaylee, by the way, in case you weren't aware, Kaylee received, from what we understand, the most significant and brutal wounds. More different than everyone else. By Steve Gonzalez, her father's own statement, her wounds were different than everyone else's. So why is Kaylee targeted with a different type of wound pattern? Now, you could argue, some have said, Bryan Kohberger was interrupted or surprised by her, and therefore he took it out on her. Let me point to that. Dylan interrupted the killer as well. Dylan, the survivor in the house, supposedly saw the killer leaving the scene. So again, if you've got this attitude that Kaylee received worse wounds because she somehow walked in on the murderer while he was killing somebody else, that doesn't explain Dylan. Why is Dylan still alive? So we have a lot of unanswered questions as to motivation. So there are people that believe that he just was misogynistic. There's this public opinion coming out that Bryan Kohberger hated all women. This is based on the fact that Bryan Kohberger supposedly graded and was reprimanded by his professors at WSU, graded females' papers worse than male students. Now, graded. Was he a teacher? No, he wasn't a teacher. He was a TA. He was a teaching assistant. As part of one of the things you do when you're going to grad school, for example, is you take on some of these supervisory type roles and help out. That's part of your part of your work in your program. So he was assisting with that, and there was allegations, and he was reprimanded for treating females in this system more harshly than males. And this led them to the belief and the public narrative that Bryan Kohberger hates all women. And this is part of the reason, the motivation why Bryan Kohberger decided to go murder women in a house full of women, because he hates women. Of course, that leaves the problem of two things. Ethan. Why is Ethan killed? He's a male. Ethan just happened to be there unexpectedly, sleeping with one of the females in her room, so that wasn't really the intention. Bryan Kohberger had it out for women. He was trying to kill women. Ethan was just collateral damage. Okay, so now explain Dylan and Bethany, two other females in the house that survived that attack. One of which, Dylan, who saw the killer eye to eye, supposedly. So again, if he hates women, and he made it worse on Kaylee because she interrupted him or something to that nature, why not Dylan? It makes no sense. We're not being consistent with the prejudice that we're putting on this case. Let's talk about another thing that people use. Bryan Kohberger was a criminal justice student, right? He's working on a PhD. He already got his undergrad work in criminal justice. So he's working on his PhD. So people have pointed out when you say, how is it that somebody killed 4 people in about 8 minutes, maybe 12 minutes, I don't know. It's the official timeline gap is about 16. I've narrowed it down to about 8 based on when Xana was on the phone. We could get into that sometime if you haven't seen my previous lives. But the point being is that it looks like 4 people were murdered in about 8 minutes. 2 at least were fighting back, probably 3 were fighting back, 1 was asleep. That's what we believe from the court documents that have been released at this point, that 3 of those people at least were awake, 1 was probably asleep. But to fight and kill 4 people in 8 to 16 minutes, not leaving any DNA behind, seems like an incredible feat. To which some people will say, because they're biased on the case, Bryan Kohberger was a criminal justice major. He knows how to get away with murder. That's what he's studying for. So he's really smart. He knew how to get away with this. And yet, I would counter, if this is your logic, Bryan Kohberger got away with it, or it left so little evidence at the scene because he's a criminal justice student and is so smart. Explain to me why he's dumb enough to buy the knife and sheath and knife sharpener from Amazon prior to the murders, and then go look for a replacement knife after supposedly he left the sheath behind at the scene. Why is he not smart enough to just leave his freaking cell phone behind in his room in Pullman, or his apartment in Pullman, rather than turning it off as he's leaving Pullman and turning it back on as he's going back into Pullman, so it could easily be traced? So you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't sit there and say Bryan Kohberger got away with this, or did so well and left so little behind at the scene and cleaned his car so perfectly that not a single bit of blood, no blood of the victim has made it into Bryan Kohberger's car, no blood of the victim has made it into Bryan Kohberger's house, no blood of the victim has made it when they say that in Pennsylvania he was up late at night with rubber gloves on cleaning his car and putting stuff in trash bags. Nobody's DNA from that murder ended up in his trash, in his car, anywhere, right? None of it. All because he's so smart. He knows how to get away with murder. He cleaned that car already. If he's so smart, explain the dumb move of the Amazon knife. The dumb move of not paying cash for a knife somewhere so that you didn't have a traceable thing. Like, some of these things don't add up. And so people just want to cherry pick what they want to say is, well, he thought he was smart, but obviously he's a dumbass, which is the answer to that. And it may be, but I really don't think that's the case. Let's talk about the autism spectrum disorder a little bit. Well, okay, so he killed people because now we know he has autism spectrum disorder. One of the things that's known of that condition is they have a flat affect. They don't feel and sense emotions the same way that they do. And so there are those who have this narrative they've built in their head. Bryan Kohberger doesn't feel the things that you and I feel. Maybe he needed to kill people to feel something, and so he wanted to know what it was like to feel something. And so because of his condition, but again, then they say, well, we can't use autism spectrum disorder as a way to remove the death penalty by saying that he has a mental disability. Well, which one is it? Is it a factor in this case because he doesn't have emotions and therefore needed to kill somebody to feel something? Is that what's going on? Or is it something else? So again, let's just be consistent with our motives and our discussions about this. Is there anything yet, Rhonda? I haven't taken a breath. Is there anything? Or are you even paying attention?
There is something interesting. So apparently the coroner is the one that told Gonzalez about the wound difference. Is that right?
Yes, right. Yes, I think the coroner's name was Mabton or something like that.
Okay. Also,
and that was before the gag order came into place.
Someone brought up that, I don't know if I found any other DNA, but wouldn't there be DNA from one victim on another victim, etc.?
Yes, there should be DNA mixed all over the crime scene. The thing is, and so these are good questions, there should be DNA left all over the crime scene. The thing is, of course, is that they're not looking for those people, right? So they're not concerned about Ethan's blood being on Xana or Xana's blood being on somebody else in the house, because it's presumed that the victims' bloods are going to be all over the place. They're not testing for that kind of stuff. They're testing for some sample of DNA that doesn't match any of the victims and is not mixed with any of the victims, so that they can place somebody at the scene.
DNA, if you will.
Yeah, right. And so, and a lot of you know, and a lot of you are familiar, there was at least 2 other samples of DNA, blood, I believe it was, one, a drop of blood of some kind on the banister that does not match to Bryan Kohberger. It's unknown male suspect 1. There is also a drop of blood, I believe, left inside of a glove outside of the house. Unknown male suspect 2. Meaning, these blood drops were left by somebody that they haven't been able to match. What does that mean? Well, not everybody's blood is in a system somewhere. Not everyone has their DNA registered in some kind of system. So, whoever left those drops of blood don't appear to have a sample in there. And because the police don't know who to go look for, they can't go to somebody's door and say, hey, can I get a DNA sample for you so I can compare it to the blood left at the scene and see if it's your blood? Because they don't know who to look for. Or they have purposely not looked for suspects because they already got their man. They already know who did it. And that was what I would argue that the prosecution is really doing in this case. The prosecution decided around December something that Bryan Kohberger was the person they were going to focus on, and then everybody else got ruled out, and it became all hands on deck to disprove the one guy did it. to the exclusion of other possible people, and even spending much time arguing about why do we care if there's unknown blood A and blood 2, or male 1 and male 2. It doesn't matter. We know who did it. It was the guy who left the speck the size of a grain of sand's DNA on the knife sheath. All right, so let's talk about the selfie photo.
Hold on a second.
Yeah.
Can you see the comments from Anthony? Could you take a look and respond to those?
There's 2 different suspects, or at least weapons. So,
Right above that too.
and right above that.
But there was no DNA found on the 2 victims downstairs from the victims upstairs.
Right. So there's all kinds. Let me talk a little bit. Thank you for bringing those questions up. Let me talk a little bit about that. So, 1, yes, there's other victims. There's other suspects' DNA. There's unknown DNA of males that were left at the scene that they don't know who it belongs to. What they do know is it's not Bryan Kohberger, and what they do know is it's not any of the victims. So it's some unknown male. Now, the counter to that for people who want to say that Bryan's guilty no matter what is that, oh, it's a party house. There's going to be blood, semen, all kinds of stuff all over that house. It's a party house. There's going to be DNA everywhere in that house. So who cares? Somebody got a bloody nose one night and it dropped on their handrail. That explains unknown suspect number 1. Now, the problem with that, of course, is there's a million reasons why Bryan Kohberger's DNA could also get in the house. That doesn't mean that he was in there killing people. Oh, but it was found on a knife sheath. Was it? Because that's what the defense is saying. The defense is saying that knife sheath was planted. The DNA on the knife sheath was planted. So yes, it looks bad if it's on the knife sheath, but we haven't even proven the weapon. And to your other point that you asked, was there more than one weapon used? Was there more than one person? I believe that's highly likely. I have a hard time, I've said this a million times, I have a hard time believing one individual killed 4 people in about 8 minutes on 2 separate floors. I believe there is plenty of evidence to indicate that a group of probably 3, at least 2 individuals went into that house. One went upstairs to the top floor, one went to the main floor, and the killings were probably happening at the same time on 2 separate floors. And yes, there is indication that there could have been more than one weapon used, that the wounds are not always consistent with the K-bar knife. There may have been a machete used in the case. There may have been a K-bar knife, but used in a different manner, meaning the killer used it and wielded it in a different way than the other killer used it. So there may be multiple people that were involved. In fact, my most likely scenario, until proven otherwise, my most likely scenario is there were multiple killers in the house, and I believe Kaylee's wounds to me. Indicate that the killer that was taking care of Kaylee had a personal grudge to settle with Kaylee. The people down on the first floor, which was the main floor, which was Xana and Ethan, they weren't really the focus of the attack in my analysis of what's going on. Can I prove any of these things? No. Because of the gag order, we're not allowed to see the autopsy photos, or not even. I don't even need to see the photos. We're not even allowed to read about the wounds. We're left but nothing to speculate based on words by, for example, Steve Gonzalez himself, who said him and his wife read the autopsy report. They spoke to the coroner before the gag order came in place, and they were clear. Her wounds had different points of origin than everyone else. Her wounds were different than everyone else. They included what has been released in official documents, deep gouging wounds, different than the other individuals. This could indicate a different murder weapon. It could have been a different weapon used on Kaylee. It may not have been the K-bar knife that caused deep gouging wounds, or somebody took more time with Kaylee and more vengeance on Kaylee. Whatever the case may be, there is an indication, yes, there is an indication that there is more than one weapon used and more than one killer. Now, here's the funny thing about that in my big rambling, I never stop talking bullshit. The prosecution has repeatedly tried to stop the defense from having the ability to say in court that there was possibly other people in the house. They have asked the judge, please rule that the defense may not bring up the idea that there are other suspects. Why? Why can't we? If you have to be able to have reasonable doubt. They need to present to a jury several things, in my opinion. Bryan Kohberger had no motive to kill the people that he killed. He didn't know them personally. He did not have interactions with them. At best, maybe he interacted with Madison, but it was Kaylee who got the worst wounds. What is Bryan Kohberger's motivation for wiping out Kaylee? And again, you can say, okay, well, he's a psychopath, or he just wanted to kill people to see if he can get away with it, or he just wanted to, whatever. The case may be is that understanding why Kaylee was targeted, understanding why the people were murdered, and more importantly, why was Dylan and Bethany left alone? Especially Dylan. Bethany was downstairs in a lower floor, so I could understand in my thinking through logically what happened that night, that maybe the killer didn't know Bethany was in the basement. But Dylan was supposedly eye to eye with the killer. Why didn't the killer take out Bethany? And then some people will argue, well, maybe he ran out of time and he needed to get out of the house. What's the timetable? Explain the timetable. What's going on? Again, leaving all these speculative things of, well, I know Bryan did it, so I'm just going to say I've got an excuse for everything that doesn't make sense, like leaving Dylan alive and all those things. It's just people picking and choosing what they want because they've already decided what the case is and what's happening. So I'll admit to you before we get into the documents that I want to get into about the selfie photo looks really bad for Bryan Kohberger. Again, we don't know what the context of that thing is. The headphones that he was wearing bothers me. I had a little video explaining why the headphones bothers me. However, I guess we're going to cover that a bit. One of the things that I wanted to point out to you was when I was covering the shooting in 2012 of Aurora, Colorado at the Batman premiere, the shooter, James Egan Holmes, supposedly wore headphones to the shooting so that he could basically drown out the sounds in the theater, the horrific probably sounds that would be in this theater. This allowed him, according to psychologists, to disassociate from what was going on in the theater. And it was loud techno music that would basically just make him feel as if he was playing a video game. It allowed him to disassociate from what was happening. So when I saw the quote-unquote creepy selfie photo of Bryan Kohberger with headphones on, I thought, oh my gosh, was he in the house? Did he wear headphones to disassociate from what would have been horrific screams? And again, if anybody was screaming because they were fighting back, we have to ask, why does Dylan and Bethany not talk about the screams? Other people nearby in a house nearby heard screams in that house at a different time, by the way. So why doesn't the people who are in the house hear the screams? But again, these things are not consistent. And again, when you have an unprecedented gag order and you're telling people not to talk to the press and not tell them what you know and not talk about the wounds and who received what wounds and when and what order they died in, and all that stuff has been kind of sketchy. We're getting more and more handle on what happened that night as the time goes by. But this leads us to making all kinds of speculations. And they're doing the same thing, by the way, with Luigi Mangione, just a dump of evidence that just basically says, here, figure it out. We've got all this stuff. So let's get into some documents. On the YouTube channel, if you're watching...
Take a breath for a second.
Okay.
Okay, so there's somebody that says that it's Bryan, and you don't need a motive. Can we talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. You don't necessarily have to provide a motive. I understand. Generally speaking, we believe in understanding with the motive and the opportunity. So to place somebody at a killing, we need to know motive and opportunity. It is not necessarily required by law to know the motive, but you certainly need to prove opportunity, and it often helps to understand the motive. Don't fool yourself that understanding the motive is not a super important part. If a wife cheats on her husband and the guy kills her, they're going to want to bring out the fact that she cheated on. They're not going to just say, oh, it doesn't matter why he killed her. We know he killed her, end of story. No, they're going to be like, here is why he killed her. She cheated on him. He was full of rage. This prompted him to, and we understand the narrative. We have to understand the whole story. So motive always comes into the story. So while it may or may not be required to prove the motive of Bryan Kohberger, it is something to factor in. And if you're telling a full story to understand, we all want to know not just what happened, but why it happened. Maybe we'll never know. Yes, they can get, to be fair, they can get a conviction without ever knowing why he did it. He has the presumption of innocence until proven guilty in a court of law. So that was a poor choice on my wording. We don't know that Bryan Kohberger did it. Whoever did it, and we don't even know if it was a he. Could have been a female for all we know. So whoever did the murders has the presumption of innocence. But understanding why they did it will help you a lot. Again, this is why, and I don't want to hit this a huge amount right now, why other suspects were being looked at early on, like the ex-boyfriend, Jack DeCour, who had just had Kaylee break up with him after, hold on. I have to prove that I'm a human being again. All right. So we know that Jack DeCour's, that Kaylee had just broke up with her longtime boyfriend of 5 or 6 years and was starting to be stalked by somebody else. That is huge motive. A person who's losing the love of his life. Everyone says it was the love of his life. His family says that she was the love of his life. She was going to move away to Texas in a month after graduation. He was losing her, and he was losing her dog. That relationship was over. She had moved on. That's a huge motive. Way more interesting motive and more plausible motive than Bryan Kohberger is just a sociopath and wanted to see if he can get away with it. Because
that's
that's
the case. He wouldn't have done the things that he did to Kaylee, or whoever did it. Somebody said she was almost gutted completely. I don't know how they know that.
Right. That is some of the rumors that have come out about what Kaylee's wounds were. They were very specific. They were very different. We can confirm. I feel like I can confidently confirm that Kaylee's wounds was different and more brutal than anyone else in the house, which leads to
somebody had something personal
right.
against her.
Which leads to it's personal. And what we don't have is any kind of motive for Bryan Kohberger having something personal. People have started to jump to guesses. Well, maybe they were out at a bar one night and Bryan Kohberger went up to Kaylee because he found her attractive and she rebuffed him and insulted him and he decided he's going to get back at her.
That's still not enough reason to go to that extent.
Right, but the point being is that even then, that's just somebody jumping to the conclusion because it makes sense to them about why he did what he did, because we're trying to make sense about why Kaylee in particular was targeted. By the way, multiple law enforcement officers and news stories came out. In the early stages of this case, law enforcement believed that one of the students was targeted. That one student, I can assure you, was Kaylee. Kaylee was targeted, and they believed that she was targeted. Jack DeCoeur, the boyfriend, was looked into quite heavily, but maybe not heavily enough, and they ruled him out based on an alibi, which, by the way, now that we're seeing what his alibi was, seems a little freaking flimsy to me. But we didn't even know for 2 years what his alibi was because they wouldn't even tell us what his alibi was. Now that we're seeing the alibi, we're like, wait a minute, did you guys really vet that guy good enough? And again, I'm not saying that Jack DeCoeur did it, but I will tell you that he has a lot more motive than Bryan Kohberger. So let's talk about, I've got a document up here on the screen. These are some of the underhanded things that are being done by the prosecution in this case. There's a fight going on between the defense and the prosecution over the term and the use of the identification of bushy eyebrows. So I realize that I tend to do these lives for about an hour and a half to an hour and a half. We're approaching an hour and I'm just getting into reading the documents. Again, I might break this up later into smaller videos so that people who want it in small chunks can get rid of all the fluff and my rambling about how the legal system is supposed to work and just get right to the documents. So here we are looking at Ann Taylor's basically the reply to the state's response to the defendant's motion in limine number 7, witness identification by bushy eyebrows. Comes now Bryan Kohberger. The first sentence in these motions is important. Who's bringing the issue up? This is Bryan Kohberger bringing this issue up. So you know from the right off the bat, this tells you who's trying to make the argument for who. So when it says the state's coming up, they're trying to play dirty pool. If the defense is bringing up, they're trying to show that he's innocent. Okay, so comes now Bryan Kohberger. Here's the argument. Mistaken identifications have been one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions in the United States for decades and still are. Let me tell you something before I continue this. I'm shitty. Eyewitness testimony is horrendous. Any law officer will tell you that. Any person in the prosecution of crime will tell you. Eyewitness testimony is horrendous. And yet we oftentimes convict on eyewitness testimony. As a small story, my wife and I witnessed a car rollover accident that happened in my rear view mirror. I watched a car pass me, come in one direction, and in my rear view mirror, I watched that car go off the road, hit a telephone pole, saw sparks fly everywhere. This was that night that it happened. We turned around and then gave our testimony, or our witness testimony, to the officers on scene. Turned out what I saw is not what happened. I'm using this as an illustration. What happened was the individual was actually following me. That was the car that went off the road. But in my mind made up a story. This car just passed me, lost control, and went into the ditch. And I thought he did a 360 because I saw his headlights coming at me for a second, right? And so I told the officers that I think he spun around. I saw the lights coming at me. Turned out the reason I saw the lights coming at me is because the car was following me. But in my mind, my mind created a story about what I saw. This is the same thing that happens when Dylan Mortensen, this is the same argument that the defense is making. There you go. It's the same argument the defense is making. Dylan Mortensen has started to matrix in, and her mind is starting to tell the story that makes sense because it's not fitting with what really happened. So now over time, Dylan Mortensen keeps being told, this is what happened, this is what happened, and now she's remembering it that way. Oh yeah, that's what happened. Because your mind starts to make it make sense. Oh yeah, that's probably what happened. I saw it that way. And then your dead remember, yeah, I saw it that way. And I was wrong. I was wrong with the officers on the scene. That guy was following us in the car and lost control of the vehicle. The car that was coming at me had nothing to do with the crime as far as I know, or the accident as far as I know. Now, maybe the other car swerved to avoid that car. I don't know. But they quickly dismissed me as being a terrible witness because they're like, well, that guy wasn't even going the direction you say he was, so you can go home now. And then I felt like a jackass. And I'm like, this is a reminder. Eyewitness testimony is shit. Because we're wrong all the time. Even about what color jacket somebody's wearing. Because our mind plays tricks with us. All right. Continuing on. When a witness swears under oath to the identification of a person on trial, the impact cannot be understated. In this case, if Dylan Mortensen is allowed to say that she saw bushy eyebrows, it will not be different than her pointing to Mr. Kohberger and saying, that is him. To make matters even more prejudicial, the state wants to admit into evidence a picture of Bryan Kohberger as if Dylan Mortensen had identified him in a photo. This is how wrongful convictions occur. And they're 100% right. What they're saying is, you, prosecution, want to say, Dylan saw a man with bushy eyebrows. Here's a picture of Bryan Kohberger with bushy eyebrows. Therefore, you can conclude Dylan saw that guy's there. That's not what happened. That, as documents have come out, and we're gonna go into the logic here and these paragraphs that have been highlighted. That's not what happened at all. Continuing on, there's literally millions of people in the world who might be described as having bushy eyebrows. The term itself is subjective, and Dylan Mortensen has a fascination with drawing eyes and eyebrows. This has been brought up in a previous case, and if you haven't heard it, or not case, a previous document, Dylan Mortensen's bedroom was full of drawings and pictures of men with bushy eyebrows. She was obsessed with bushy eyebrows. She drew them all the time. She said that she watched true crime all the time, and that she had dreams of being like chased by somebody with bushy eyebrows. So when she's in a drunken state and she remembers the man having bushy eyebrows, this is exactly the matrixing kind of shit that your mind will do. If she is obsessed with bushy eyebrows, if she watches true crime all the time and she sees a killer in the house, she can remember, falsely perhaps, that he had bushy eyebrows, because that's what she's seen over and over and played out over and over again with her head. They only touch on it briefly in this document here by saying that Dylan Mortensen had a fascination with drawing eyes and eyebrows, but that came out in more detail about all the pictures that were in her room. She had a fascination with this, and they only cover it in one sentence, but there's a whole document, and we have talked about it on the previous live. Anything I need to take a breath for, Rhonda?
I'm curious if you know who Adam is.
I don't know who Adam is. The name's not...
Somebody said that I think Maddie told Adam everything.
We'll have to table that for now. I don't remember Adam's name at the moment. All right,
yeah,
so
Juanita said that.
Okay, yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. If somebody can send me a private message, I will do some more digging into that. So continuing on in this document, page 3, Dylan Mortensen was interviewed 5 times. Law enforcement was involved with each interview. According to the state, Dylan Mortensen's multiple descriptions of the intruder are based on her own recollections and were not the result of suggestive identification procedures employed by law enforcement. In other words, they're saying, hey, we didn't tell her the guy had bushy eyebrows, right? So that's what they're attesting to, is like, we didn't prompt her, we didn't push her, we just interviewed her and she on her own said bushy eyebrows. It shouldn't.
Adam was an employee at the bar.
Oh, okay. Know a little bit about that, but not Adam's by name by specific. But we'll table that for now, because I got 5 documents that at least I want to get through, if I can. Page 3 still. It should not be ignored either that the limited amount of time that Dylan Mortensen had to view the intruder or her state of intoxication. A witness is less likely to provide an accurate identification from a fleeting view, and a witness's attention is likely compromised when they're intoxicated. Both are true of Dylan Mortensen. He just passed me. I saw him for a moment. I was frozen in shock as he passed me, and it was very fleeting. And by the way, in her statements, she stated, I was really drunk. I'm not even sure if I didn't dream the whole thing. And people said, that's bullshit. She never said that. Yes, she did. And it's going to be brought up here as well. Dylan Mortensen saw the intruder briefly in a dark hallway, and even in her own words, was probably, quote, very drunk and tired when she saw the intruder at 4 a.m. That's according to official testimony and being brought up again by the defense. Continuing on page 5 actually. Sensory overload has particular relevance to the encoding phase. It can lead to so much incomplete sensory acquisition that confabulation, the creation of substitution of false memories through the later suggestion, can occur to fill in the many gaps that exist. This is exactly what I was talking about. In my mind, when I saw the car pass me and then looked in my rearview mirror and saw headlights coming at me for a moment, I made up a story in my mind. My mind did it all on its own. That car must have spun around and I saw their headlights coming as they were doing a 360 and went into the ditch. That's not what happened, but that's what my mind conflated. So that's what they're talking about here. Dylan saw something very briefly, and now her mind is conflating what actually happened, and eyewitness testimony is the last thing that you're going to rely on. The state's going to rely on it heavily, because all they've got is eyewitness testimony from Dylan that she saw somebody with bushy eyebrows and a speck of DNA in the house. And maybe they've got Bryan going to the scene and after the scene, which sounds like a lot when so yeah, it's not all they have, but the point being is that to get him in the house and not just pulling up to the house, it's eyewitness testimony, and it's that K-bar knife / sheath with the speck of DNA. So, and her testimony is horrendous. In this case, the time period of observation was seconds at most, according to the defense, with limited lighting and under stress and expressed fear. And with the witness who was repeatedly expressing that she was not sure. In all those interviews, she's like, I'm not sure. What color were his eyebrows? I'm not sure. Did you see both eyebrows? No, I'm not sure. I might have seen only one eyebrow. Is it this guy that they showed her a picture of Bryan Kohberger? Is it this guy? I'm not sure. I don't think so. I don't know. You know, she's not sure about anything. In fact, she's not sure that she didn't dream it. She was in a frozen shock phase and did not know if it was a dream. And there's a time delay in her reporting what she saw. This is also critical. The time delay in reporting what Dylan saw. She did not report it immediately. There is a significant time delay in which other people were discussing what happened in the house. And once you start discussing it, your brain starts to make the story. Oh, yeah, I think I saw him walk out the back door. Because he had to have gone out the back door. The back door was open. Oh, yeah, I think I saw him walk out your mind starts making the story. This is the reason why eyewitness testimony is horrendous. A third factor has the most potentially negative effect on memory retention, the post-event misinformation effect. Exposure to subsequent information affects how earlier memories are retained and retrieved. This means that an eyewitness exposed to post-event misinformation can accept erroneous or even non-existent details as if they were true. Again, everything what we're saying. Once you start being told what happened that night, you remember it happening that way that night. And here's the big kicker. One of the big kickers that was out of this document. Big shocker! In this case, not only was there an 8-hour delay in the reporting prior to the first law enforcement interview, Dylan Mortensen was allowed to mingle with Bethany Funk and many other friends. Law enforcement did not separate the friends who came to 1122 King Road prior to the interviews, and no warning was given for them not to discuss the facts, and no effort was made to limit such discussion. Many of the friends who were at the 1122 King Road residence when police arrived also stayed in the same hotel that night on November 13th, 2022. There was also extensive media coverage. Post-event misinformation must be considered as a factor on the accuracy of Dylan Mortensen's memory and retention. Let me explain the shit that just happened right there. Did you catch that? All the time, when you come into a crime scene that's going on, you separate everyone to make sure that their stories stay the same. The law enforcement did not separate Bethany Funk and Dylan Mortensen about their story. They didn't separate anybody and make sure that the stories matched. They didn't separate them. Not only that, but they allowed the girls to go to a hotel and stay in a hotel together. Multiple people who were at that scene stayed in a hotel that night, further allowing them to get their stories straight and talk to each other. The prosecution has specifically stated there was no time for the girls to have made up a story and talk to each other. There was tons of time for the girls who have talked to each other. Again, does that mean that they are guilty, that they did something wrong? Not necessarily. But what it does mean is now you have a conflation of stories. Your mind starts to hear, oh, did you hear that? Yeah, I heard that. I thought I saw this. Yeah, I think I saw that too. You start to feed each other information, and your story starts to become more and more similar, which is the exact reason why law enforcement is taught to separate people at the scene, so that they can make sure that here's your story, these match or they don't match. Nobody did that. That's a major problem. It's a major red flag that law enforcement didn't do the just due diligence of separating eyewitnesses and making sure that your accounts matched before allowing them to continue to talk about it and even stay in a hotel before continuing on other interviews. By the time that Dylan Mortensen testifies, almost 3 years have passed. Now, what they're meaning is when Dylan Mortensen testified to a grand jury. So a grand jury has heard the testimony of Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk in a grand jury testimony. Grand juries are convened in private. The defense is not there. The public is not there. And the grand jury's job isn't to convict or do anything like that. The grand jury's job is to hear all the evidence in the case and decide, is this something that a jury should hear? Is there enough evidence here that the jury should have to decide this case? It is not deciding that a person's guilty or not. That's not the purpose of the grand jury. But a grand jury has already heard Dylan Mortensen's testimony, which was given almost 3 years after her initial viewing of the suspect, when she goes on the stand and says, here's what I saw that night. In the meantime, she has talked to law enforcement on at least 5 different occasions. She spent the night with other friends talking about it. They've been talking about it for years. And then she gets on the stand and she has crystal clear memory about what happened that night. How much of that is conflated because you've been talking about it for years? Conclusion. For this reason addressed above and in Mr. Kohberger's initial brief, the court should grant Kohberger's motion in limine to exclude Dylan Mortensen from using the words bushy eyebrows to identify the intruder that she saw, and to exclude Dylan Mortensen from identifying Bryan Kohberger based on bushy eyebrows. So what they're just basically saying is, look, if I have to get on the stand and explain to you that Dylan Mortensen was obsessed with bushy eyebrows and had pictures of bushy eyebrows and explain to people how your mind conflates things and makes up stories, it's going to be a massive waste of everyone's time. Easier would be that all things considered that that we all know about Dylan Mortensen, that her testimony was drunk, that she may have dreamt it, that she got time to talk about it with other friends. Don't allow her to use the term bushy eyebrows, and then we won't have an argument. And the prosecution is like, no, we want her to describe Bryan Kohberger on the stand as, I saw that guy with bushy eyebrows, because they want the jury to be prejudiced against him. I call that dirty pool. All right, text messages. This is another shocker, in my opinion. Are you hanging in with me? I'll try to be done in the next 20-30 minutes here. State's reply to the defense's objection in limine, text messages and testimony. So they've got some text messages here. Originally, the prosecution just wanted us to show us the messages that you see here, 2:10 a.m., and then they wanted this call at 4:19 a.m. Originally, the prosecution left out the 3:51 a.m. If you're looking on YouTube, you know what I'm talking about. 3:51 a.m. They originally kind of excluded that she made a new phone contact in her phone. Dylan Mortensen was awake at 3:51. At 4:19, Bethany calls Dylan. There's an exchange back and forth. I said at the time when they first released this information, where's the context on this? The girls are clearly talking about something that's already happened in the house, and they're aware of it, and they're talking mid-conversation. No, it starts out with like, no, he was wearing all black and had something over his face. Where's the context? There was no context. This is just the first message that they show us, right? And they're hiding shit from you. So the defense came forward in a motion in limine and said, if you're gonna tell the fucking story about the text messages, pardon my French, and please don't get me banned. If you're gonna tell the thing, then tell the whole story. Show us all the text messages, because you're leaving out what's happening. You're leaving out the context of those conversations. All right, so let's continue on. I want to get down and we'll come back up to this section. I want to get down to this paragraph. The state's evidence will show Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk went to sleep at 4:37 a.m. The state seeks to introduce the following phone records the next morning by Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk. This is such shit. I can't believe it. So the state wants to say they had a brief exchange at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then the girls fell asleep. And then at 10:23 in the morning, Dylan texts to Madison Mogan, one of the people who died in this event, "Are you up?" That is proof to the prosecution that Dylan just woke up. See, this is Dylan just waking up. The first thing she does is she texts one of the friends in the house, "Hey, are you up?" That's their proof.
Bullshit.
That's their proof that Dylan was asleep until 10:23, right? And that's what they've got on this timeline. I'm gonna jump over to the document that the defense said, if you're gonna tell the story, tell the whole story. Let's talk about this. This is the document that you can see on YouTube of the actual text conversation. And after the girls text each other about somebody in the house, Bethany Funk is on Snapchat at 4:34 in the morning. Bethany Funk is on Instagram at 4:37 in the morning. Bethany Funk calls her dad at 7:30 in the morning. Bethany Funk calls her dad at 8 in the morning. Bethany calls another number at 8 in the morning. Bethany calls home at 8:01 in the morning. Bethany calls her mom at 8:02 in the morning. Dad calls Bethany in the morning. Dylan Mortensen, 8:05 in the morning, is on Instagram. Uh-oh! You just submitted paperwork saying that Dylan woke up at 10 o'clock and texted her friend, "Are you up?" Because that's when she woke up.
Yeah.
What the hell is Dylan Mortensen doing on Instagram at 8:05 in the morning? She's awake. And so is Bethany. They're both awake. I'm not sure those girls ever went to sleep. That's what I'm thinking. But the prosecution's playing dirty pool. Oh no, here's the proof. 10 o'clock is when she texted her friend, "Are you up?" That's when Dylan woke up. My ass. 8:05, Dylan's on Instagram. 8:41, Bethany Funk takes photos. Photos of what? Photos of what? Is she doing selfies in her bedroom, or are they taking photos of the crime scene? They don't tell us what she took photos of. 9:04, mom texts Bethany Funk. 10 o'clock. This is still before when they say Bethany Funk woke up. Dylan, sorry, this is before Dylan woke up. So they say Dylan woke up at 10:26. Dylan at 10 o'clock. She already did something at 8 in the morning. Now she's at 10 o'clock. Dylan Mortensen messages incoming and outgoing on Snapchat. Dylan Mortensen on Instagram. Dylan Mortensen on Indeed, all at 10 o'clock. Dylan Mortensen messages incoming and outgoing on Snapchat at 10 o'clock. Dylan Mortensen to Madison Mogan. That's the one right there. That's where the prosecution picks up. 10:23, Dylan Mortensen texts Madison Mogan. And literally, let's go back to this document. This pisses me off. I'm sorry I'm yelling. Let's pick this up. This is from the state. Other communications and interactions on social media during the time frame is irrelevant for the purpose of the court making an admissibility and determination. Regarding Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, other communications, defendant will have the opportunity to cross-examine them at trial. So what they're saying is, we know it's bullshit. She was not sleeping. We're going to tell you she was sleeping, and all the communications that show she wasn't sleeping and she was on Instagram and Snapchat are irrelevant. Am I losing my? Am I the only one who has a problem with that? How is it irrelevant? The girls are awake. You're telling us they fell asleep and didn't wake up until later, and now you're saying all the other shit that shows that they weren't sleeping, that's irrelevant. And if you've got a problem with it, the defense can cross-examine them on the stand. Those girls shouldn't be on the stand. Their eyewitness testimony is shit. They shouldn't even be on the stand.
I think they're in on it somehow.
Well, yeah, that's what it looks like. All right, so I'm sorry I'm all spun up. I see that I'm missing stuff, by the way, on YouTube, but it looks like Rhonda's all over that. Pat, my wife is such a good camper. All right.
So somebody said they thought the girls might be freaked out laying in bed all morning, too freaked out to wake up.
That's fair. Then don't lie to us and say the girls weren't awake and calling everybody and their dog, including friends and family, and texting people left and right. The prosecution wants you to believe the girls fell asleep and didn't wake up, and it leads to all kinds of other problems. Why don't they smell certain things in the house? Why are they not going to check on people? It's been hours. It's been 8 hours. You can't simply walk upstairs and go check on your friend. I can
Call the cops, you saw a strange man in your house.
Right. Call the cops. Like, none of it, for some people it makes sense to you. Oh, the girls were terrified. I can understand in the moment when you think there's a killer, or you think, and again, they didn't think there was a killer. Their story is they had no idea anyone was killed. They just thought there was a strange man in the house. Okay, fair. If you're afraid there's a strange man in the house, I do understand time going by. But as hours and hours go by, you're not going to go up and check on things. You're not going to call the police and say, "Hey, I'm terrified to go upstairs in my house. I think somebody was in my house. Can you come check it out? Just give me a welfare check. Just make sure that the house is safe because I haven't heard from my roommates." That doesn't happen for 8 hours. Something stinks. I don't believe that those girls were just asleep, because that's the argument. Because again, let me clarify for the person, and again, I'm not trying to pick on you at all. For the person who says the girls were just scared. The argument is even the prosecution knows that doesn't make any sense. So the story is the girls fell asleep. That explains the 8-hour gap. It's not the girls were terrified for 8 hours, because even the prosecution knows that makes no sense. We talked about the hotel, by the way, already, about how the girls were allowed to stay in the hotel after that event and get their story straight.
That they were at a hotel during the time that they were, quote, sleeping.
Oh, and that's another thing that's come out, is that there is reason to believe that it's possible the girls weren't even in the house when it happened. But that's if you believe the girls were involved, because if the girls left the house during the killings, that would indicate that they're involved. And I'm hesitant to go that way. By the way, I want to point out, I have gotten so many leads on other people that are in other reasons for this crime. It's insane. I've got names of other murders that happened around the time. Did you know that there was other... Okay, not murders. Did you know there was other mysterious deaths of college students all in the year leading up to these killings and after that that people are saying are all connected? That this is not just the only Idaho 4 that's going on here. But
why is this one so publicized?
Because it was just so sensational. It's four women, or well, 3 women and a man stabbed to death brutally in the middle of the night. It was just the magnitude of it caught national attention. All right, so we're going to go to, we covered that, the text messages. We're going to go to the inclusive thing. So there's an argument.
Hold on.
Huh?
Somebody said when he was arrested, he said, "Was I the only one?" Did he say something like that?
So yes, that has been widely reported, that upon his arrest, the first thing Bryan Kohberger said was, "Has anybody else been arrested?" Which would be an indicator for the defense that Bryan Kohberger may have been involved, may have thought that somebody else should have been picked up as well, because he wasn't the only one. In fact, I've got long form videos explaining why I think Bryan Kohberger could have been the getaway driver, that he may have actually been involved, but may not have even been inside the house. But he may know what happened, and he may have been there.
So Harlan, what dad are you talking about? Are you talking about Kohberger's dad?
So we'll get that clarified in a minute. Yeah, so yes, let me clarify what I didn't clarify. It has not been confirmed that Bryan Kohberger said, "Has anybody else been arrested for this?" That has been a rumor that has been circulating for years. And again, in a case that has unprecedented gag order, the prosecution and law enforcement has not revealed to the public if that is indeed something that Bryan Kohberger said when he was picked up. So it was leaked by somebody that was said, and it's been repeated over and over again as maybe there's more people involved, because Bryan Kohberger himself asked, "Has anybody else been arrested for this?" But again, it's rumor and speculation. And again, I would argue we wouldn't all have to rumor and speculate for 2 years if you were just open about shit instead of hiding everything behind an unprecedented gag order. So there was an argument, and I don't think I'm going to go over this one in length. I've got it shown on YouTube so you can take a look at the one I'm talking about. This is about inconclusive data, and I'm just going to summarize it rather than read it. Basically what it states is the prosecution had an expert that came on that said that they tested, for example, DNA that was underneath Madison Mogen's fingernails. Right? So there was fingernail DNA under one of the victims. And oddly enough, it was the victim that didn't fight back. So there's a belief that Xana was awake and has defensive wounds, meaning that she was defending herself from the attack and had to have been awake. Ethan Chapin also had defensive wounds and indicated that he was awake and fighting back or defending himself. Kaylee Gonzalez also had indications of fighting back and being awake during the attack. Madison did not, however, but Madison's the one who supposedly has DNA under her fingernails. They tested several individuals, including Jack DeCour, Kaylee's ex-boyfriend, and others, including Bryan Kohberger. And what the prosecution's witness had determined was they could not. It was inconclusive about whose DNA it was. Now, what's the problem with that? So the defense had somebody come on and do extensive further testing and 100% excluded Bryan Kohberger from being possible. Like, it wasn't inconclusive, because inconclusive means it could be Bryan Kohberger's DNA is there, or it might not be Bryan Kohberger's DNA there. But the defense had an expert that came on and said, we can prove conclusively Bryan Kohberger's DNA is not under Maddie's fingernails, period. And it's not inconclusive anymore. It's not inconclusive. The prosecution does not want the state to be able to present a witness that says it has been excluded, that Bryan's been excluded. And they want the jury to hear that whether or not Bryan's DNA is under her fingernails is inconclusive. Why? Why do they want that? Because it leaves the jury saying, well, it could be then. If it's not, what you're saying is it could be or it couldn't be, it's inconclusive, that means it could be Bryan Kohberger's DNA. And since we know everything else we know about Bryan Kohberger's DNA, chances are good that's Bryan Kohberger's DNA. And that's what the prosecution wants the jury to hear, that it was inconclusive it could be or couldn't be Bryan Kohberger. Another expert has said it absolutely cannot be Bryan Kohberger. His DNA was not under the fingernails, period. And they want the prosecution to make sure that witness does not have a chance to testify in court, and they want to leave it to it's inconclusive whether it was his DNA or not. That's dirty pool. Just let both sides present their case. Let the jury hear the truth. This is why I say it's personal. The prosecution wants a conviction. They're not just saying, hey, here's what the facts are. And if he gets, and if he's not the guy, then it's okay. We're just going to present why we think he is. That's not what they're doing. They're like, we know he is, and we're going to only show you the things that prove that he is. Elantra footage. We're going to talk a little bit about this document that I highlighted a few things. Mr. Kohberger's, so this is, again, Bryan Kohberger coming with a new motion. Mr. Kohberger's motion sought to prevent the state from saying that the vehicle depicted in the 1112 King Road camera was a Hyundai Elantra, and that the vehicle was the same vehicle identified as an Elantra on 1125 Ridge Road camera. That is in the province of the jury. The state points out that there is no, so in other words, so the defense is saying, you want to say this car is seen continuously coming to the scene. The state has already agreed on this paragraph. The state points out there is no continuous video stream to observe a path of travel. As the state points out, they cannot show a vehicle at 1112 King continuously moving to the location of 1125 Ridge, because they are two separate videos separated by distance and opportunity for other places to drive or park and opportunity for other vehicles to appear on camera. It is a question for the jury. What are they trying to say here? What they're trying to say is the prosecution wants to lead the jury to believe that there's continual video footage of Bryan Kohberger's car, which hasn't been proven as Bryan Kohberger's car, going from a camera on 1125 Ridge Road to 1112 King Road, and that's the same car that you see in both photos, as if to imply to the jury, there's no question those are the same vehicle, it's a continuous thing. And yet they've already admitted, the prosecution, that there is no continual video footage, and it could be two separate cars. But the prosecution does not want the jury to hear that. The prosecution wants to basically have the jury say, we've got the video driving past this camera, and now this camera, and it's the same car, when they themselves have admitted behind the jury's back, because this is all being talked about behind the jury's back, that there's no continual footage of that vehicle. It could be two separate vehicles in theory. All right, let's go to the state's response to the defense motion in limine number 9, excluding Amazon click activity evidence at trial. This is complicated, and I don't know whether we can get into this in great deal. The argument basically is several points. The defense wants an expert to come into the court to explain what click data is on Amazon, because there's an allegation by the prosecution that Bryan Kohberger went out and searched for a K-bar knife, sheath, and sharpener and purchased it off of Amazon, and then later went back and looked for a replacement knife after the killings. And again, replacement knife is very prejudicial. Why, if Kohberger did go out to look for a knife again, calling it a replacement knife is prejudicing the jury to believe he lost the knife and now he needs to get a replacement for it. It could have been a second knife that he wanted to buy. That's if he even bought it, because what the defense is saying is there's argument he didn't even buy that, right? So to get to the gist of this, the prosecution wants to basically state that click data from Amazon proves Bryan Kohberger searched for a K-bar knife, sharpener, and sheath, and purchased one. And the defense wants to bring in an expert to explain what click data really is and how click data is generated and how leads are generated on Amazon, so that people understand how the algorithm is made, and explains that it doesn't necessarily mean Bryan Kohberger searched for the knife. It could have been served up to him as a recommended thing because of other things that they buy. For example, the entire family uses the same Amazon account. They are campers. They go camping. And so they point out in here that the click data also includes, and I'm trying to find it here, that they purchased several things over a month, including for a road trip or hiking, including roadside repair kits, tire inflators, backpacks, bear spray, and other things. The family camps. The family uses this entire account. So the defense is saying, one, you have to prove that Bryan Kohberger and not one of his family members did that. And two, the jury needs to understand what click data means. It doesn't necessarily mean Bryan Kohberger literally clicked on finding a K-bar knife. It could have been served up to him in hey, other people who bought bear spray also like to buy a K-bar knife. Would you like to see one? And that would be considered click data. The prosecution does not want that explained to the jury, because they want the jury prejudiced to, oh my God, he literally went out looking for the K-bar knife. He's the killer. So there's a big fight about the Amazon click data and whether or not the judge is going to allow the defense to bring in an expert to explain to the jury what click data is and what it really means and what it doesn't mean. Does it mean that Bryan Kohberger searched for, clicked on, and bought a knife? Or was it just served up to him as recommended things to buy because his family hunts and camps or whatever and buys stuff like bear spray and camping gear and all that stuff? Do I need to take a breath, Rhonda?
There's just somebody that hops in here and said he's guilty.
Oh, fair.
So I got to respond to that a little bit. But
Fair
I'm
enough.
Typing. It's okay.
We're almost done, by the way. We're almost done. I'm going to let you guys go for the night. So thank you, by the way, for hanging out with me for so long. We're going to talk about the advanced timing records a little bit. So, and this gets, again, very confusing. So I don't know if I want to get into all the details for you. But what it basically comes down to is that advanced timing, so the state, the prosecution is using the whole Bryan Kohberger's phone pinged in the area of the King residence several times over the course of days, indicating that he was stalking the girls for a period of time, had been going there regularly. His phone gets picked up on that cell tower on a regular basis, and was picked up that night at various times, proving that Bryan Kohberger then came finally at his last time for that attack in the early morning hours. And they're doing so on very, very limited AT&T information that doesn't tell this whole story. What the prosecution, what the defense has said is there is such thing as called AT&T timing records. It not only shows what phone pinged a certain cell tower, but the time it took to ping here and then the time it took to ping here, therefore allowing you to determine the path of travel and the direction of travel of the vehicle. And so the state, or the defense, wants to bring in AT&T timing records to show what they will say is that Bryan Kohberger was driving in the opposite direction of the killings at the time of the killing. He was not driving to the murder scene. He was driving away from that scene before the killings began, is what they're basically trying to say. And they're saying that that can be proved by the AT&T timing records, which show what time it pinged here and then pinged here, showing what direction the vehicle was going in. The prosecution wants the timing records not to be shown to the jury. Why? Because, and this is the huge complicated thing in the fight that's going on in the court system, at the time that they requested the AT&T records for the phone, AT&T did not have a habit of providing AT&T timing records. It existed, they had timing records, but that was not the AT&T's practice to turn over AT&T timing records to law enforcement prior to, and this is what the document says if you're looking, prior to June of 2023. So the paragraph that's important, regarding AT&T before June 2023, again the murders happened November 13th, 2023, so this is a policy that existed before then. AT&T retained timing advance records for 7 days. So in other words, they would already be gone by the time they were requested. These records were not routinely provided in response to legal demands prior to June 2023. After June 2023, AT&T started providing these records pursuant to legal demands and began to retain timing advance records for 13 months. So what the prosecution is trying to say is they requested timing. They requested AT&T records. It wasn't the policy of AT&T to provide timing records, so they didn't get those timing records, and they're good at that because they have Special Agent Balance from the FBI who created this great, nice spreadsheet, PowerPoint spreadsheet that shows Kohberger's phone is pinging at all these locations. That's all we need to show the jury, that Kohberger's phone's pinging at all these places, and the FBI even says so. Now, the fight that's going on that's super confusing is that the defense indicates that there's proof that that Special Agent Balance received the AT&T timing records, because while the state of Idaho may not have been able to get the AT&T records, the timing records, the FBI certainly was. And the FBI had requested and obtained the AT&T timing advance records. But then the FBI chose not to tell anybody what the AT&T timing advance records say because it doesn't look good for the prosecution of Bryan Kohberger. That's what they're basically saying, that the FBI did get the AT&T timing advance records, and they want to leave it as it's good enough, the PowerPoint slideshow that we presented without the timing records, because that's all you really need to know, even though they say even the FBI knows the timing records show that Bryan Kohberger was going in the opposite direction. Does that make any fucking sense? It's super hard to understand. I got to stop dropping the F-bomb. I don't want to get any restrictions on my account for dropping the F-bomb. Bad on me. All right. I think that's all we need to do to cover that because I've been keeping you so long. I want to let you go. We're going to talk just again about balance, detect a special agent balance, and just say that I feel like the defense is trying to set up an argument that the special agent balance from the FBI might have a beef to score or settle with Bryan Kohberger and is being overzealous. And I was just going to point out one paragraph in here. Yeah, here it is. In many cases, it appears that the state's initial disclosures resemble a laundry list of topics, and then, once Mr. Kohberger complied with the court's order, the state took advantage of learning a great deal about Mr. Kohberger's records and evidence and tailored new disclosures to address Kohberger's experts. These are not rebuttal disclosures, they are the state's case in chief. Numerous examples are laid out in detail in Exhibit 1. One example is the state's Amazon expert Cox. A second and more extreme example is FBI Special Agent Balance, Nick Balance. Many of these experts' disclosures are based on evidence and data that has still not been disclosed to Mr. Kohberger. This is particularly true of Special Agent Balance, whose ever-changing reports and opinions are based on material that has not been provided to Mr. Kohberger. So what they're accusing Special Agent Balance, Nick Balance, repeatedly of is that he is hiding something. He wants you to see a very limited PowerPoint slideshow that shows that Bryan Kohberger was all over the area and therefore guilty by association or location. But Balance knows that there's shit that would not look good for the conviction of Bryan Kohberger, and he wants that to be ignored. All right. Then I'm going to talk last. I think this will be the last one because we're just running out. Well, almost last. Okay. So last document we'll cover, and then I'm going to go one more final thought before the wrap up. So 3D model of the house. As you know, and many of us are baffled as to why, the house at King Residence where the murders happened has been destroyed, literally demolished while the students were on vacation, away from classes, and starting at the early morning, dark hours in the morning before anybody would wake up. The house was destroyed essentially overnight so that no one had a chance to really protest. Yes, the defense knew it was coming. The prosecution knew it was coming. Certain members of the family implored them not to tear down the house because it might be important. Why would it might be important? Because we are now trying to explain how a killer, one guy, gets out of his car, dressed or undressed, into a house, kills 4 people on 2 separate floors, gets somehow undressed or out of the bloody clothes, puts it somewhere, gets back into his car, and drives away in 16 minutes. And if you count the amount of time that the actual murders took place, it's about 8 minutes. So you're really talking about timing. And the prosecution will say, hey, no problem. We got the timing taken care of before we destroyed the house. We had an expert come in who walked the house and proved that you can physically walk to all those rooms and have committed those murders in the amount of time. And that's all we're going to need for testimony. We'll have our expert come on and say, yep, I walked the house. It can be done in that time. And now we've torn down the house. And then they said, well, okay, the house is torn down, but we'll provide a 3D model of the house. The 3D model now that they're going to bring to the table is not to scale. And so now there's an argument by the defense. So you're going to use a not to scale model to try to explain to the jury what happened, but it's not to scale. And the defense in this document is admitting to you. And am I yelling a whole bunch? I'm yelling a whole bunch. I'm sorry. Anyways, the defense, the prosecution, I'm not doing any better at stopping yelling. The prosecution is admitting that, yes, they fully intended to provide a 2-scale 3D model. However, things changed, and after they tore down the house, they decided it wasn't important for the jury to have a 2-scale model. So just close enough is the same as having a floor plan. Okay? So plenty of people are convicted on a floor plan. Here's the basic layout. It's nothing more than a floor plan. It doesn't need to be to scale. Unless, of course, you're going to get into, can a person see around the corner from this vantage point? Can I see that person from here? If you're going to get into the nuances of where Dylan was standing when she saw the man with bushy eyebrows that may or may not be allowed to say in court, if you're going to talk about where she was standing, you probably need a 2-scale model. And you need to be able to understand this is exactly where she was standing. This is exactly where he is. Maybe you can do an approximation, maybe, but that's the argument. So the defense is saying this is bullshit. You tore down the house, and now you told us you told us originally you were going to use a 2-scale model, and now you're backpedaling on that. You're just going to use an approximation, which that approximation, one can argue, is going to be an approximation that supports the official narrative, not what really happened necessarily. And then lastly, there's this big document, which I will not cover. I mean, it's huge, that has a whole bunch of details about what exact seconds and times the prosecution intends to pull out of some very specific footage. I recommend you read it. If you're really curious about this case, it's got so much information in there, and we don't have time to cover it tonight. It is this one right here. State's reply to the defendant's objection to motion in limine, self-authentication of records in reliance on IRE 803, blah, 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 blah. If you want to look at that document, again, it's on YouTube. You can freeze the frame. You can look at it and find it to get it to match up exactly that document. I'm just going to scroll through for your shits and giggles. All these highlighted paragraphs start to lay down exact times of things that were happened, some time markers that haven't been previously disclosed. So if you're really super interested in trying to put together what happened that night, you want to scan through this document. There's a lot. I didn't find any super shockers, just to let you know. So what's more interesting is the stuff that they were going to show and they now decided isn't important, like bank records of various places. And I was trying to figure out why they're getting the bank records for all these people. And now they've said they don't intend to show that at all in court. So they overreached with a lot of stuff, and now they're finally telling the defense, yeah, we don't plan on using that, which is exactly what the defense has been trying to argue from day one. You can't just give us a million things and say, figure out what our case is. Now they're finally being forced a little bit by the judge to say, okay, we're not going to use this bank information, we're not going to use this bank information, and like, for example, on the screen that I'm showing, we're going to show the footage between 5:25 a.m. and 5:26 a.m. Great. Instead of giving us 2 hours of video footage and saying, you figure out what we're going to show, now they're starting to say, we're going to use 5:25 to 5:26 in the morning. So a lot of this stuff is starting to pinpoint. It's a good win for the defense to be able to pinpoint what exactly you're going to show. Because again, if they come out and they show something else and it surprises the defense, that's going to be objection. We needed to have time to know that you were going to pull out something that happened 2 hours before that. You told us it was only going to be 5:26 and 5:27. Now you're going back to 4 o'clock in the morning. They need to let the defense have time to argue that, or you're going to have a mistrial. So you need to be careful about this stuff. I'm exhausted, folks. I've talked a million miles an hour. I'm flush in the face. I've been shouting at you like a toddler. I feel super bad, but I am super excited that 80 of you roughly are still hanging out with me after all that time.
Loves your passion.
I do have passion. Please consider checking out the YouTube channel if you didn't. The YouTube channel is going very slowly. It's my primary thing because, as you can see, I'm a wordy bastard. I'm not really meant for TikTok. In fact, I'm having a really hard time, people, coming up with the 30 to 60 second splash that I can do in TikTok to stay relevant, because everything I talk about is lives. Everything I talk about is long form. So follow me there if you care to support this. And again, I believe that Bryan Kohberger has the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. I'm not saying he didn't do it. He may have done it. He may have done it with others. More than likely, there's more killers involved than the one. And I didn't even get into all the other rumors about the pool party and whether Brent Kopacki was at the pool party, the other individuals who were murdered, the allegations that Kaylee was insulting somebody and insulted someone's manhood, which might have also led to somebody being... There's all kinds of stuff that I'm just now uncovering as I'm getting deeper into that. People in the area in Moscow are saying there's so much more to the story that's not being told in the media. I live close enough by. I might end up in Moscow, or I might end up dead. I don't know. Thanks for following the show.
Don't close off yet.
Okay.
Somebody wants to know how to find the YouTube channel.
It's right above my head. This is the YouTube channel, Devil's Advocates 2024. Thanks for asking. I also have, by the way, a backup channel called Devil's Advocates Backstage, or Backup. It's just my personal life, talking about what I'm doing behind the scenes, what I'm working on, not the actual formal videos. I've got a podcast that I've started on there, so it's called The Devil's Briefcase. I'm covering Luigi Mangione and Bryan Kohberger's cases, so there's long form videos that are more polished. There's also all the recordings of my lives from YouTube. As long as I don't get kicked off of TikTok, I'll stay on TikTok, but every once in a while TikTok slaps my hand and they won't allow me to advertise or promote myself or anything like that. So this is all organic growth. Can I say goodnight yet?
Natasha wants all those details. What details?
Oh my gosh, Natasha, I can't go through all those details right now. I got the document up on my screen on YouTube, and maybe we'll do another live about it later on. But again, it wasn't super shockers, but it's still super interesting. All right. Thank you for telling me that the briefcase is great. My podcast. Thank you for coming, everybody. Thanks for all the support and love, and have a great evening.
Thanks, Tara. Appreciate the shout out. Good night.